The late winter of 1879 struck the northern Minnesota frontier like a frozen hammer. Temperatures plunged to nearly -30 degrees Fahrenheit, and for homesteaders scattered across the plains, survival became a daily calculation of firewood, time, and endurance. For Jonas Fletcher, that winter delivered a hard truth every settler feared discovering too late. His cabin, built exactly by the book, was failing him. Fletcher had done everything right. His log cabin followed the territorial guides word for word. Straight pine logs carefully notched. Mud and moss packed tightly between the seams. A wood stove placed where the chimney would draw cleanly and efficiently. Local carpenters assured him it was sound, proven, reliable. Yet the cold found its way inside. Icy air slipped through every microscopic gap, cutting across the floor like blades. Frost bloomed on the interior walls, tracing the weaknesses in his construction like a cruel map. By midwinter, Fletcher burned 3 full cords of firewood in a single month, not for comfort but simply to keep his family alive. Even then, the cold never fully retreated. Across northern Minnesota, the story was the same. Identical cabins. Identical suffering. Settlers were locked in a losing battle against a winter that showed no mercy. But while most accepted the cold as unavoidable, Fletcher did something different. Quietly, and against the advice of nearly everyone around him, he began experimenting with an idea borrowed from old-world building traditions, a method that involved pulling air through a buried underground channel. Neighbors mocked it as pointless digging, a waste of effort. That single decision would change everything. Jonas Fletcher had arrived in the Wind River Valley 3 winters earlier with confidence hard-earned over decades. He was no novice. 20 years in logging camps from Maine to Wisconsin had taught him how timber behaved, how wood expanded, contracted, and failed. He knew how to notch logs tight enough to resist wind. He knew the difference between a sturdy cabin and a death trap. He followed every established rule. Logs 8 to 10 inches thick. Tight saddle notches cut with a sharp axe. Chinking made from whatever mud and moss the land offered. A quality cast iron stove purchased from Duluth, designed specifically for frontier heating. The first winter lulled him into false security. Temperatures dipped below zero only occasionally. The drafts around his ankles were irritating but tolerable. Frontier life, he told himself, came with discomfort. Then came the winter of 1878. Night after night, Fletcher woke to the sound of wind whistling through cracks he thought were sealed. By morning, frost coated the inside walls, revealing every failure in stark white patterns. The cabin floor, laid directly on leveled earth, pulled cold upward through his boots even when he stood near the stove. By the third winter, the truth was undeniable. The cabin was hemorrhaging heat. Spring freeze-thaw cycles had cracked the mud chinking, leaving finger-wide gaps between logs. Cold air poured through with such force that candles flickered constantly. Loose papers scattered across the rough-hewn table whenever the wind picked up outside. Worst of all was the stove. Fletcher had invested in a good one, but the harder he fed it, the worse the problem became. Packed full of oak and birch, the fire burned so hot it created violent updrafts. Those updrafts sucked freezing air through every crack in the cabin with hurricane-like force. The stove glowed red-hot, while a water bucket 6 feet away froze solid. On the coldest nights, sparks shot up the chimney like fireworks, wasting fuel and creating constant fire risk. Inside the cabin, temperatures swung wildly, scorching near the stove, freezing near the walls. There was no balance. The sleeping loft trapped smoke and superheated air, yet somehow remained colder than the room below. Fletcher often woke with splitting headaches from fumes and numb fingers from the cold. Comfort was impossible. His neighbors faced the same misery. The Olson family, 2 miles north, burned 4 cords of wood a month and still sent their youngest children to relatives during severe cold snaps. The McGreedy brothers, experienced carpenters from Ohio, built what many considered the finest cabin in the valley. Perfectly notched, expertly chinked, equipped with an expensive Chicago-made stove. It failed just like the rest. What separated Fletcher from the others wasn't skill, it was refusal. He refused to believe this suffering was inevitable. As he split his 5th cord of firewood in a single month, Fletcher remembered stories told by his immigrant grandfather. Tales of earth-sheltered homes in the old country, houses that stayed warm through brutal winters while burning half the fuel of conventional buildings. Fletcher had always dismissed those stories as folklore. Now they sounded like solutions. The turning point came during a conversation with Henrik Larsson, a Norwegian immigrant who had arrived the previous spring. Larsson mentioned that his family's farmhouse back home drew fresh air for its fireplace through a stone-lined channel buried beneath the frost line. The air arrived pre-warmed by the earth itself. The concept hit Fletcher instantly. He knew the ground just 6 feet down stayed warm even in deadly cold. He'd felt it under his cabin floor. The earth moderated temperature naturally. Why not use that stability? When Fletcher mentioned the idea to his neighbors, the reaction was brutal. Samuel Wright, the valley's unofficial construction authority, laughed outright. He called it desperate foolishness. Local carpenter Thomas McKenna dismissed it even more harshly. Fire heats cabins, Fletcher. Not fancy holes in the ground. At the monthly Grange meeting, the idea provoked open laughter. The formula was proven, they insisted. Tight logs. Good chinking. A proper stove. Anything else was desperation. But Fletcher did the math. At his current rate, he'd need over 40 cords of wood to survive the winter, an impossible task. And he couldn't ignore what he'd already observed. The earth beneath his floor stayed warmer than the air inches above it. During one brutal February night, as temperatures plunged to -35, Fletcher woke hourly to feed his stove while ice crept across the walls beside his bed. By morning, the decision was made. With the buried air system fully operational, the results were immediate and measurable. Fletcher's firewood consumption dropped to approximately 2 cords per month, a reduction of nearly 33%. That single change freed countless hours once spent cutting, splitting, and hauling timber through snow and ice. Timber through snow and ice. More important than the savings in labor was the transformation inside the cabin itself. Gone were the violent temperature swings that had defined frontier winters. Instead of scorching heat near the stove and frozen corners along the walls, Fletcher experienced something previously unknown in his homestead: relative thermal balance. Warmth spread evenly through the living space, creating a stable, livable environment rather than a daily fight for survival. The buried pipe solved another critical problem settlers had long accepted as unavoidable. Before the system, strong winter gusts created pressure differentials around the cabin, sucking frigid air through every crack with astonishing force. No matter how carefully Fletcher sealed the walls, the wind always won. Now, with all incoming air channeled through the underground pipe, surface wind pressure lost its power. Drafts vanished. The cabin no longer breathed through its wounds. Fletcher documented everything. Each day he recorded wood consumption, morning and evening interior temperatures, and outside weather conditions. His notes reveal the full impact of the change. On the coldest night of the winter, -32 degrees Fahrenheit with 20-mile-per-hour winds, the cabin's interior never dropped below 55 degrees. And he achieved that warmth using half the fuel he would have burned the previous year. Word of Fletcher's success began to spread, and visitors soon arrived, not out of curiosity but recognition. In February, Eric Anderson, a recent Norwegian immigrant, stepped inside Fletcher's cabin and immediately understood what he was seeing. He recognized the system as a variation of techniques his own grandfather had used in Scandinavia. Anderson explained that similar earth contact heating methods had sustained Norwegian farmers for centuries, especially in regions where timber was scarce and every cord of wood represented weeks of back-breaking labor. That connection to old-world knowledge changed everything. Among frontier settlers, few groups carried more respect for cold-weather survival than Norwegian and Swedish immigrants. Their endorsement lent credibility to Fletcher's work in ways personal success alone never could. The buried pipe was no longer eccentric experimentation, it was proven tradition. By spring, skepticism faded. Neighbors who once laughed could no longer deny the evidence. Fletcher had survived one of the harshest winters on record while burning far less fuel than anyone else in the valley. Travelers carried stories of his warm cabin to distant settlements, and the idea quietly began spreading across the northern frontier. But Fletcher knew his work was unfinished. The buried pipe solved air infiltration, but the cabin itself remained a thermal disaster. Even with pre-warmed air, heat poured through the walls, floor, and ceiling. On calm nights, when the pipe worked at peak efficiency, Fletcher could feel cold radiating directly from the log walls. 3 seasons of drying had caused the rough-hewn timber to shrink and shift, opening gaps that conventional mud chinking could never permanently seal. Heat loss continued, slower than before but relentless. The next breakthrough arrived in the form of an unexpected teacher. Klaus Weber, a German immigrant newly arrived in the valley, visited Fletcher's cabin during a March cold spell. Within minutes, he identified weaknesses American frontier building methods largely ignored. Weber had grown up in the Black Forest, where winters stretched half the year and fuel wood was precious. His family's farmhouse relied on techniques refined through generations of cold climate survival. Weber explained that American settlers treated chinking as little more than gap filler. Whatever mud and moss could be gathered quickly. European builders, by contrast, engineered chinking as both insulation and structure. The difference lay in the mixture. Proper chinking required a carefully balanced blend of clay, straw, and organic fibers, dense enough to insulate, flexible enough to move with the logs, and strong enough to resist cracking through freeze-thaw cycles. In April, Fletcher and Weber set to work. They harvested clay from a deposit Fletcher had discovered while digging his buried pipe, selecting the most plastic variety, material that would bind tightly without excessive shrinkage. Straw came from leftover wheat stubble, cut into lengths between 2 and 4 inches for optimal interlocking. Weber insisted on adding chopped cattail fiber gathered from nearby wetlands, explaining that it provided tensile strength and prevented separation under thermal stress. The mixing process demanded precision. Weber demonstrated the traditional ratios: 1 part clay, 3 parts chopped straw, and half a part cattail fiber. Water was added slowly until the mixture reached what he called proper plasticity: wet enough to pack tightly, dry enough to hold its shape. Fletcher learned to test the mix by forming it into balls and dropping them from shoulder height. If the ball held together, the mixture was ready. Application required techniques unfamiliar to most frontier builders. First, they removed all existing chinking and thoroughly cleaned the log surfaces. The new material was applied in layers, each pressed firmly into contact with the wood and allowed to set before the next was added. The final layer was shaped to shed water while maintaining continuous contact with both logs. The results were immediate. Unlike conventional mud chinking that cracked and fell away, the clay-straw mixture flexed with the logs and maintained a tight seal. More importantly, its thickness provided real insulation. Fletcher noticed the difference the first time he pressed his hand against the interior wall. The cold radiating through the logs was dramatically reduced. Weber's second innovation addressed heat loss where the cabin bled warmth most severely, along the lower walls and floor. He introduced Fletcher to the Scandinavian practice of interior sod lining, a technique that added both insulation and thermal mass. The method involved cutting dense sod blocks 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 6 inches thick from stable grassland areas. In May, Fletcher began installing the sod lining, working methodically around the cabin's interior perimeter. With each improvement, the cabin transformed, not into luxury, but into something far more valuable on the frontier: efficiency, stability, and survivability. Fletcher stacked the sod blocks grass side inward along the lower 3 feet of every interior wall, forming a continuous barrier between the log structure and the living space. Each block was pressed tightly against the next, with joints staggered like brickwork to eliminate thermal bridging. The dense root systems and organic matter within the sod provided insulation, while the soil mass absorbed and released heat slowly, smoothing out temperature swings that had once made the cabin unbearable. To protect the sod and complete the installation, Fletcher covered the interior surface with a skin of rough pine boards salvaged from shipping crates. This wooden facing prevented moisture damage, shielded the sod from wear, and created a narrow air gap that further enhanced insulation performance. When finished, the walls looked intentional and refined rather than improvised, an interior far more polished than most frontier cabins of the period. The third element of Fletcher's envelope improvements involved reducing the volume of space that needed to be heated. Weber explained that European farmhouses concentrated winter living into smaller, more manageable areas, conserving fuel while improving comfort. Fletcher applied this principle by reorganizing the cabin interior around his stove. He constructed a sleeping loft directly above the stove area, taking advantage of rising warm air. The platform was built from split logs laid across heavy pine joists hewn from trees on his own land. Covering roughly 1/3 of the cabin's floor area, the loft measured 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, with just enough headroom for sitting upright. Access was provided by a sturdy ladder made from straight-grained oak. To further improve heat retention, Fletcher hung thick wool curtains from wooden rings, allowing the loft to be closed off from the main room during the coldest nights. Once drawn, the curtains trapped heat in the compact sleeping space, creating a warm refuge even when temperatures outside plunged far below zero. A cabin transformed. The impact of these envelope improvements became undeniable during Fletcher's first winter with the complete system in place. In December of 1879, as outside temperatures dropped to -28 degrees Fahrenheit, the cabin remained comfortable using far less fuel than even the improved buried pipe system had required the previous year. Fletcher's wood consumption fell to just over 1 cord per month, nearly a 50% reduction from his original usage. More importantly, warmth was distributed evenly throughout the living space. The sod lining eliminated the cold wall effect that had once made the cabin perimeter unlivable. The clay straw chinking stopped the subtle air currents that had silently carried heat away from the stove. The loft allowed Fletcher to retreat into a tightly heated sleeping area at night while keeping the main room usable during the day. As always, Fletcher documented everything. Interior wall temperatures measured at multiple locations stayed within 5 degrees of each other, even on the coldest nights. Before the improvements, he had recorded differences of 15 to 20 degrees between warm and cold areas. The combined system, buried air supply, insulated envelope, and space optimization, performed far beyond expectations. During the brutal winter of 1879 to 1880, neighbors endured cold snaps that killed livestock and forced families to burn furniture for emergency heat. Fletcher, meanwhile, maintained stable, comfortable living conditions while consuming less fuel than many cabins required during mild weather. His methodical approach had turned a failing frontier shelter into a model of cold climate efficiency, one that would quietly influence cabin construction across the Northern Territories for decades. One final weakness. Yet despite these successes, Fletcher still faced a critical limitation. Even with pre-warmed air and superior insulation, his cast iron stove suffered from the same flaw as all metal heating devices. It released heat quickly when fed and lost it just as quickly when the fire died. On the coldest nights, Fletcher still woke every 3 hours to stoke the firebox. By morning, the cabin temperature dropped nearly 20 degrees, despite all other improvements. The final breakthrough came through Fletcher's growing friendship with Dmitry Koff, a Russian immigrant who settled in the valley that autumn. Koff had grown up in a region where winter temperatures regularly reached -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and fuel wood was so scarce that families planned heating strategies like military campaigns. His grandfather had been a master mason, renowned for constructing massive heating stoves that burned efficiently and retained warmth for 12 to 15 hours after the fire went out. Koff explained that American settlers treated stoves as simple fireboxes, devices meant to burn fuel and radiate heat immediately. Russian builders viewed stoves as thermal storage systems, designed to capture the energy of burning wood and release it slowly over time. The key was mass. By surrounding the firebox with enough masonry, heat could be absorbed during combustion and radiated back into the living space long after the flames had died. Building heat that lasts. Fletcher began constructing his thermal mass system in September of 1880, gathering materials throughout late summer and early fall. He quarried fieldstone from a granite outcropping 2 miles from his cabin, selecting dense pieces ranging from fist-sized stones to blocks weighing more than 50 pounds. Each stone was inspected carefully, free of cracks that might cause failure under repeated heating and cooling. He also collected wagon loads of clay-rich soil for mortar and purchased lime from a supplier in Duluth to create a mix capable of withstanding extreme temperatures. The foundation came first. Fletcher removed his stove and excavated a pit beneath it, 3 feet deep, 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, extending well beyond the stove's footprint. This cavity was filled with tightly fitted stones set in lime mortar, forming a stable base that would not shift under the enormous weight of the hearth. Construction of the thermal mass hearth pushed Fletcher beyond any masonry work he had attempted before. Under Koff's guidance, stones were laid in carefully bonded courses, each layer tied to the next with lime mortar mixed with sand and chopped straw. The finished hearth platform measured 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and rose 18 inches above the cabin floor. Its top surface was finished with flat stones fitted so precisely that joints measured less than a quarter inch. Behind the stove, Fletcher and Koff erected a massive fireback wall using the largest stones they had collected. Rising 4 feet high and extending 2 feet beyond the stove on each side, the wall measured 18 inches thick, an enormous reservoir of thermal mass positioned exactly where it could absorb the most heat. For the first time since arriving on the frontier, Fletcher was no longer chasing warmth. He was storing it. The stones of Fletcher's hearth were laid with minimal mortar joints, fitted so precisely that the fireback wall appeared almost seamless. This wasn't craftsmanship for appearance, it was engineering for heat transfer. Every stone touched the next as directly as possible, allowing thermal energy to move freely through the mass rather than being trapped in thick mortar seams. But the most critical breakthrough came from modifying the stove's exhaust system. Dmitry Koff showed Fletcher how conventional stoves wasted enormous amounts of energy by sending their hottest exhaust gases straight up the chimney. Together, they constructed a series of internal baffles using thin stone slabs and iron plates salvaged from old agricultural equipment. These baffles forced hot exhaust gases to follow a serpentine path through the masonry before reaching the chimney, transferring far more heat into the stone mass. To control the system, Fletcher installed iron dampers at 3 key points in the flue. During startup, bypass dampers allowed strong draft to establish quickly, preventing smoke from backing into the cabin. Once the fire burned cleanly, Fletcher closed the bypasses, forcing exhaust gases through the longer heat capture route. What had once been waste heat now became stored energy. The stove's placement completed the system. Cool air entered through the buried pipe, drawn toward the stove base by rising heated air. As it passed around the massive stone hearth, it warmed gradually, then rose toward the loft before cooling and descending along the exterior walls, creating a natural convection loop that distributed heat evenly without mechanical assistance. The first full test came during a November cold snap when temperatures dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Fletcher built a strong fire and maintained it for 3 hours. By 9, the stone hearth and fireback wall were too hot to touch. He allowed the fire to burn out completely and recorded temperatures through the night. At midnight, 3 hours after the flames died, the cabin temperature had dropped only 5 degrees. By morning, 12 hours later, the interior remained 15 degrees warmer than outside, and the stone hearth was still warm to the touch. Fuel efficiency exceeded even Fletcher's expectations. In December of 1880, his first full month using thermal storage, he burned nearly 50% less wood than the previous winter, despite colder average temperatures. More importantly, he no longer woke every few hours to feed the stove. One deliberate fire each evening was enough. When the Arctic came to stay, the ultimate test arrived in January of 1881. On the 15th, a massive Arctic storm system swept into the northern territories and refused to leave. Winds exceeded 40 miles per hour. Temperatures plunged to -42 degrees Fahrenheit. Unlike typical storms, this one lingered for nearly 2 weeks, pushing every heating system to its absolute limit. Fletcher faced the crisis with preparation no conventional settler considered necessary. Before the storm arrived, he inspected every component of his system. He cleared debris from the buried pipe intake, checked clay joints for air leakage, and tested dampers to ensure smooth operation under extreme temperature differentials. Most critically, Fletcher planned his fuel use. Based on 2 years of data, he calculated the storm would require one substantial fire per day for 14 days, consuming approximately 10 cords of wood. He prepared the wood in advance, splitting it to precise sizes and storing it in a shed attached directly to the cabin, eliminating dangerous trips outside during blizzard conditions. When the storm struck, neighboring cabins began failing almost immediately. The Olson family burned through their entire monthly wood supply in 5 days. Samuel Wright, the carpenter who once mocked Fletcher, was forced to burn furniture and wall boards just to survive. The McCready brothers, proud owners of an expensive Chicago stove, ran fires non-stop yet still watched temperatures fall near freezing. By the second week, they abandoned their cabin entirely. Fletcher's system never faltered. His buried pipe continued delivering air at 38 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The insulated envelope prevented heat loss. The thermal mass hearth released stored warmth with steady reliability. During the storm's worst phase, Fletcher recorded interior temperatures between 58 and 65 degrees for 14 consecutive days. He built one fire each evening, slept through the night, and woke to a warm cabin every single morning. He used 9 3/4 cords of wood total. Less than many cabins burned in a single winter week. The aftermath. When the storm finally broke on January 29th, the difference was undeniable. Fletcher emerged with fuel remaining and his cabin undamaged. His neighbors faced weeks of recovery, repairing heat-warped stoves, replacing burned furniture, and scrambling for firewood. Quiet adoption followed. That spring, Eric Anderson built his own buried pipe system. Other families requested help improving their chinking using the clay straw method. Letters describing Fletcher's techniques appeared in territorial newspapers and settlers' guides, emphasizing measurable results, not theory. Even logging camps adopted modified versions of Fletcher's hearth after supervisors experienced its efficiency firsthand. Outro: the lesson that endured. Jonas Fletcher never patented his ideas. He never published a manual or claimed to invent anything new. What he did instead was more powerful. He listened to old knowledge. He tested it carefully. He documented results honestly. And by combining forgotten traditions with systematic thinking, he solved problems frontier builders believed were unavoidable. His legacy wasn't just warmer cabins or lower fuel use, it was a method. Identify the real problem. Learn from those who survived before you. Experiment carefully. Improve relentlessly. In a world obsessed with shortcuts, Fletcher proved something timeless. True innovation often comes not from inventing new tools, but from finally understanding the old ones.